The fire had gone cold again. She knew this before she opened her eyes. She knew it the way you know a thing when your body has been trained by years of repetition, by the particular bite of the air against her cheek, by the stillness inside the walls, by the absence of any warmth that might have crept under the thin wool blanket she shared with her husband. She lay still for just a moment, one stolen moment, before the sounds of the house descended upon her like a tide. A baby crying in the next room, the eldest boy coughing, that rattling bark that had plagued him since October. The distant clatter of cartwheels on the cobblestones outside, already in the dark before dawn, men moving through the city to do the labor that kept Victorian England turning. She rose. It was 4:30 in the morning. It was always 4:30 in the morning, and so began another day in the life of an ordinary Victorian woman, a wife, a mother, a domestic laborer of extraordinary scope who would work from before the sun appeared to long after it had gone, who would manage a household of staggering complexity with almost no legal rights, little social recognition, and virtually no rest. Her name was perhaps Mary, or Eliza, or Sarah. She is every woman who lived and breathed and quietly endured in the great gray sprawl of 19th century Britain, in the coal-stained cities and the wind-scoured countryside, in the cramped terraces of Manchester and the fog-wrapped streets of London. She is the woman history tended to overlook, not because she did nothing, but because what she did was considered simply, before we go any further into this world. And it is a world worth understanding deeply, a world that shaped the very foundations of how we live today. I want to take just a moment to speak directly to you. If you find value in stories like this one, narratives that restore lost voices, illuminate forgotten lives, and bring the past back to vivid, breathing life, please consider subscribing to this channel. Every subscription tells us that this work matters, that history told honestly and with compassion is worth your time. It helps us continue making these long-form historical documentaries, and it costs you nothing but a click. Now, let us go back. Let us follow her through this day. Let us try as best we can to understand what she endured. The Victorian household did not warm itself. It had to be made warm, and that process fell almost entirely upon the woman of the house, or in wealthier homes upon the women she managed. In the homes of the working class and lower middle class, which is to say, in most homes across Victorian Britain, there was no domestic servant to do this work. There was only her. And so Mary, or Eliza, or Sarah, rose from her bed in the dark and began. She dressed quickly, her fingers fumbling with the hooks and buttons of clothing, layered for warmth because the house was genuinely bitterly cold. There was no central heating. There was no hot water that arrived from a tap. There was no thermostat to adjust, no electric light to switch on, no ease whatsoever to the first act of her morning. There was only the fireplace and the range in the kitchen, and the knowledge that if she did not make them work, her family would go cold and hungry into another gray day. She knelt before the kitchen range, that great iron beast that dominated the Victorian kitchen, and she raked out the cold ash from the night before. This alone was a task of some duration. Victorian coal fires produced prodigious quantities of ash, cinders, and clinker, and all of it had to be removed before the fire could be rebuilt. The ash was not simply thrown away, it was sifted. The fine ash went into a pail for later use. It could be spread on the garden, used to clean silver, even used as a basic abrasive for scrubbing. The cinders, the partially burned pieces, were put aside to be reused. Nothing was wasted. In a working-class Victorian home, waste was not carelessness. Waste was catastrophe. Then she laid the fire. First, crumpled newspaper, if they had any, if they could afford it. Then small pieces of kindling, arranged with the care of someone who had learned by bitter experience how quickly a morning could go wrong if the fire refused to catch. Then the coal, piece by piece, arranged to allow air to circulate. Then the match. The small miracle of the Victorian era, the lucifer match, which itself had replaced the far more laborious tinderbox only a generation or two before. She struck it, held it to the paper, and waited. If the chimney was drawing well, the fire would catch. If the chimney was blocked, if the soot had built up, if there was a bird's nest lodged somewhere in the dark above, The smoke would billow back into the kitchen, and she would spend the next 20 minutes with streaming eyes and a hacking cough, trying again. The chimney sweep came once a year if they could afford it. Between visits, the chimneys of Victorian Britain slowly choked with soot. Children, boys as young as 5 or 6, were once sent up inside those chimneys to scrape them clean, a practice so horrific that it eventually drew the attention of reformers and was nominally banned by Parliament, though enforcement was patchy, and the practice continued in various forms well into the Victorian era. Mary had perhaps read about this in the newspaper. Perhaps she had seen the sweeps boy herself, small and blackened, emerging from a neighbor's chimney like something from a nightmare. Perhaps she did not allow herself to think about it too long. There was breakfast to make. The Victorian breakfast was not a simple affair, even in modest homes. The cultural expectation, reinforced by etiquette manuals, by women's magazines, by the general moral architecture of Victorian life, was that a proper household produced a proper breakfast. This meant hot food. It meant porridge, perhaps, in the Scottish manner, thick and heavy and filling enough to sustain a man through a 12-hour working day. It meant bread, which she had likely baked herself the day before because shop bread was expensive and not entirely trusted. In households that could afford it, it meant eggs, bacon, perhaps kedgeree, that curious Anglo-Indian dish of rice and smoked fish that the Empire had imported, along with all its other complicated inheritances. It meant tea, always tea, the great lubricant of Victorian social life, the beverage that had become so thoroughly embedded in British culture that it was now essentially non-negotiable. She made tea with water she had boiled on the range that was only now beginning to throw real heat. She made porridge, stirring it constantly with a long wooden spoon while simultaneously watching the baby, who had been placed in a wooden chair near enough to the fire to be warm but far enough to be, she hoped, safe. The older children came downstairs in stages, still half asleep, their faces pale in the early morning light that was just beginning to seep through the small, smoke-darkened windows. She fed them in order of need, the baby first, then the toddler, then the older children, and last of all herself. If there was anything left, which there often wasn't, not quite enough, and she would eat the scraping from the pot and call it sufficient. Her husband ate well. This was not cruelty exactly, or at least it was not understood as such. It was policy. The Victorian household operated on a strict hierarchy of nutrition, and at the top of that hierarchy sat the wage-earning man. He needed his strength to work. He needed his calories to labor. This was the logic, stated plainly and without apology in domestic manuals of the period. Isabella Beeton's famous Book of Household Management, published in 1861 and consulted by Victorian women across the social spectrum, was largely silent on the nutritional needs of the housewife herself. Her job was to provision others. Her own body was, in a very real sense, an afterthought. The nutritional consequences of this arrangement were severe, and they accumulated over time. Victorian women in the working class were frequently malnourished, not in the dramatic, visible sense of starvation, but in the chronic, grinding way that comes from years of eating last and least. Anemia was endemic. Vitamin deficiencies were common. And yet these women were simultaneously experiencing the most physically taxing reproductive lives imaginable. The average Victorian working-class woman might expect to be pregnant 7, 8, 9 times during the course of her married life. The pregnancies came, and the births came, and the nursing came, and the recovery, much such as it was, came, and then the next pregnancy came, and throughout all of this, the physical demands of running the household never paused, never reduced, never acknowledged that the woman performing them was perhaps not entirely well. Let us be precise about this, because imprecision allows us to slide past the reality too easily. What did a Victorian housewife actually do during the hours of a single day? The list is extraordinary in its scope. She cleaned, not in the modern sense of running a vacuum across the carpet and wiping down the counters. She cleaned in the way that Victorian domestic life required, which is to say she fought a constant and largely losing battle against a level of dirt and contamination that we can barely imagine today. The streets of Victorian cities were thick with horse dung. In London in the 1890s, 11,000 horses worked the streets daily, depositing an estimated 1,000 tons of manure every 24 hours. That filth came in on boots, on coat hems, on the wheels of perambulators. The coal fires that heated every home in Britain laid a constant film of soot on every surface, on walls, on ceilings, on furniture, on curtains, on the faces of children. Before the Clean Air Act of 1956, London and other industrial cities were perpetually dark with coal smoke, and every household bore the consequences. She swept the floors every morning. She scrubbed the front doorstep. This was important. The front step, the face the house presented to the street, the visible evidence of her competence and moral character. A woman whose front step was dirty was a woman who was not coping, and not coping was one of the great social disgraces available to a Victorian wife. The step was scrubbed with a hearthstone, a whitish stone that left the step pale and clean and respectable. This was done on the knees, in all weathers, before the day had properly begun. She did the laundry. Monday was washing day in almost every Victorian household, and washing day was an ordeal of such magnitude that women of the period wrote about it with the gravity of someone describing a military campaign. The water had to be heated, large quantities of it, requiring hours of fire tending and lifting of heavy copper pots and kettles. The clothes were sorted, soaked, boiled in the copper, then laboriously scrubbed against a washboard to remove the ingrained dirt of a working week. Victorian clothes were not easily washable by modern standards. Corsets could not be submerged. Woolen outer garments had to be brushed rather than washed. Delicate fabrics required hand washing with the most careful attention. But the linens, the shirts, the undergarments, the children's clothing all went through the copper, and the process took most of the day. The clean clothes were then rinsed multiple times to remove the soap, because soap residue irritated skin and damaged fabric, and wrung out by hand or through a mangle, that iron device with heavy rollers that could, and occasionally did, trap fingers and crush them. Then the clothes were hung to dry, which in the perpetual damp of a British winter could mean they simply became slightly less wet while hanging indoors for 2 days. Ironing came next, with heavy flat irons heated on the range, exchanged constantly as they cooled, used to press the elaborate pleats and frills and tucks that Victorian fashion demanded. She cooked. Not one meal, but several across the course of the day, for a family whose caloric needs were substantial and whose expectations were shaped by cultural standards that demanded hot food, properly prepared. In middle-class homes, the cooking was more elaborate still. Multiple courses for dinner, the careful management of a menu that demonstrated the household status and the wife's competence. Mrs. Beeton's cookbook contained over 900 recipes and was organized around the premise that a good household required constant, skilled, attentive culinary labor. A working-class wife had fewer recipes to worry about but more fundamental constraints. How to make a small amount of food stretch across many people, how to use every part of every ingredient, how to create something nutritious and filling from the cheapest possible materials. Offal was eaten, bread and dripping was eaten. Scraps were recycled into broths and soups. Nothing was thrown away. She managed money. This is often overlooked, but the financial management of a Victorian working-class household was a task of considerable skill and stress. The family income arrived in the form of her husband's wages, handed over in whole or in part on Saturday night, and from this sum she had to cover rent, coal, food, clothing, and all the incidental expenses of family life. There was no margin for error. There was no savings buffer. A week of unexpected illness, a broken piece of equipment, a rise in the price of coal, any of these could tip the household into crisis. Some women kept extraordinarily careful account books, tracking every penny with the meticulous anxiety of someone who knows precisely what the consequences of an error look like. Others dealt in a more intuitive economy, holding the numbers in their heads, juggling and recalibrating constantly. Either way, the mental load was immense and unceasing. She cared for the sick. Victorian medicine was primitive by our standards, expensive by any standard, and largely inaccessible to working-class families who could not afford a doctor's fee. When her children became ill, and they became ill frequently because Victorian cities were rife with infectious disease, because tuberculosis, typhoid, scarlet fever, diphtheria, whooping cough and measles moved through the close-packed urban population with terrifying ease. Because childhood mortality was shockingly high, she was the primary caregiver, the nurse, the diagnostician, and the comforter. She knew the home remedies: goose fat rubbed on the chest for a cough, warm broth for a fever, chamomile tea for a stomach upset. She knew the limits of those remedies too. She had sat by the beds of children who did not recover. 1 in 5 children born in Victorian England did not survive to their 5th birthday. 1 in 5. That is a statistic, but behind every instance of that statistic was a mother who had done everything she knew how to do, and it had not been enough. We must speak plainly about the Victorian woman's body, because the constraints placed upon it were not merely physical but legal, medical, and ideological. She was corseted. From the time she was old enough to be considered a young lady, sometimes as young as 13 or 14, a Victorian woman wore a corset that compressed her waist and reshaped her torso into the fashionable silhouette of the era. The Victorian ideal of femininity demanded a small waist, and the corset delivered it through the simple application of enormous pressure. Well-documented medical conditions were associated with long-term corseting: displacement of the lower ribs, compression of the liver, restriction of lung capacity, chronic digestive problems. Women fainted, not as a theatrical affectation, but because their lungs could not fully expand. And yet the corset was also, for Victorian women, a complicated artifact. It was scaffolding. It provided back support for women who spent their days bent over washboards and cook fires and cradles. It was armor. It was identity. Victorian women did not universally experience the corset as oppression, even when it was also, undeniably, harmful. She gave birth, likely many times, in conditions that we would today recognize as genuinely dangerous. Before the late Victorian period, the germ theory of disease was not widely understood or accepted, and surgical hygiene was essentially non-existent. The maternal mortality rate in Victorian Britain was shockingly high, estimated at roughly 5 deaths per 1,000 live births in the early Victorian period, though this figure almost certainly understates the reality, particularly among the poor, whose births went unregistered and unrecorded. Childbed fever, puerperal fever, killed women who had survived labor only to develop a raging infection in the days that followed. It killed them because doctors and midwives moved from patient to patient without washing their hands, without understanding that the invisible thing they were carrying from one woman to another was death. When Ignaz Semmelweis demonstrated in the 1840s that hand-washing dramatically reduced maternal mortality, he was largely dismissed, mocked, and eventually institutionalized. It was not until Joseph Lister's antiseptic techniques gained acceptance in the 1860s and 1870s that the medical establishment began, slowly and grudgingly, to accept that invisible agents could cause disease. In the meantime, women died. In the meantime, Mary or Eliza or Sarah lay in her bed after the birth of each child and hoped, with the particular silent desperation of someone who has no power over what is coming, that this time she would not develop a fever, that this time she would survive. She had almost no legal rights. This is not an exaggeration. Under the doctrine of coverture that shaped English law for centuries and remained embedded in Victorian legal culture despite piecemeal reform, a married woman was legally subsumed into her husband's identity. Before the Married Women's Property Act of 1870 and its more comprehensive successor in 1882, a woman's property, her wages, her inheritance, all became her husband's property upon marriage. She could not own property in her own name. She could not enter into contracts. She could not sue or be sued independently. If she left her husband, she had no legal right to her children. Custody defaulted to the father. If he was violent, she had almost no recourse because the law was slow to intervene in domestic matters, and social shame functioned to keep women silent about what happened behind closed doors.